If you thought last week was rough for injuries, wait till I go over this week's injury report. Add that to the fact we have 6 teams coming up on a bye week in week 7. You're going to need some help off the waiver wire too. This was definitely the week of the upset. Undefeated teams lost and a lot of underdogs saw some unexpected victories. You were probably also upset at the fact that some fantasy players did not perform as you expected and some big names also got injured. The biggest, of course, is San Francisco, not just the fact that they lost to Cleveland with a backup quarterback, but they also lost 2 of their best players. That would be Christian McCaffrey, who left with an oblique injury and did not come back, and Deebo Samuel, who left with a shoulder injury, also not to return. Now with CMC, I guess the good news is it's not a leg, knee, ankle issue, anything like that. It's no oblique. This shouldn't be a long absence, if anything. Maybe a week, possibly 2. Of course, it depends on a lot of things. And this is just speculation so early. So what do you do if you have CMC? You should already know if you watch our videos every week, because I told you who to pick up just a few days ago. Before we get to that, let's do the rest of the injuries. And Deebo Samuel also left. You know, he's had his share of injuries throughout the years. It seems like he's also due to miss maybe a couple weeks. Shoulders can be tricky. X-rays were negative, so that's the good news. Wouldn't be surprised to see the Niners rolling without Deebo next week. Well, obviously this means Brandon Ayuk, you gotta fire him up. Maybe George Kittle has another good game. I'm not gonna roll out a guy like Ronnie Bell or Ray McCloud or even suggest him as a pickup other than in like a deep league, because those guys just have targets spread out among them, and they do have plenty of other guys like the ones I just mentioned to throw it to. Another biggie at running back, just when you thought Monty was gonna carry your team each and every week, David Montgomery out with ribs injury, and he also did not come back. Didn't do anything before he left, so just brutal on both counts. Negative x-ray here as well, so that's good news, but again, you might be without him in week 7. Just like a couple of weeks ago, we thought it's Jahmyr Gibbs time. Well, it's not, because Jahmyr Gibbs also has not played the last 2 weeks. Not sure what his status will be coming up, so I'm going to recommend that you're going to go out and pick up a guy like Craig Reynolds, but I'll get to him in a minute. Another big running back injury, and that was Kyren Williams, who's on the way to having one of his best days of the season, of his career. I mean, he was running great, scored a touchdown, and then late in that game against the Cardinals, he left with an ankle injury. Not a lot of news here, so I'm not sure what the severity is or prognosis. Again, you're just gonna have to monitor throughout the week. But what's interesting here is that the backup, Ronnie Rivers, also left, this time with a knee injury. So what happened is we saw Zach Evans get 4 carries. Didn't do a whole lot with him, but the fact that he's on the field and both of the top 2 running backs for the Rams could potentially miss, well, it means Evans is now interesting. I did talk about him a couple of weeks ago as a stash on Beat the Breakout. If this is his time, I mean, look, I don't want to necessarily start him, but I've got to consider stashing him, especially if I had Kyren Williams. Now onto the quarterbacks, and I mean backs plural, because there are several starters who could be absent in week 7. The main one is Justin Fields. Already wasn't really doing a whole lot against the Vikings. I mean, that whole game was just kind of disappointing from a fantasy standpoint, but a wrist injury kept him out, so we saw rookie Tyson Bagent make his debut. It goes without saying that without Justin Fields, this whole offense all of a sudden becomes maybe terrible. Now, Fields did get x-rays on his wrist, didn't show any break, but obviously with the wrist for a quarterback, that's something that is going to be very significant. So good chance he misses some time. I will say this is different feel than like an Anthony Richardson type of injury, and not because it's just a different injury, but you know, AR is a rookie. There's no need to rush him back. They're going to be very careful with him in his first season. With Fields, this guy really needs to prove something this year with the Bears, especially the draft capital that they have. I have a feeling he's not going to be out too long. As soon as he's ready to play, he'll be back because he needs to. And then Trevor Lawrence in the very end of that game, which already was a blowout against the Colts until late, and then he went down with apparent knee injury. Fortunately, after the game, he said he should be okay. Doesn't seem like it's anything of note. And then a guy who just cannot seem to stay on the field for too long, Jimmy Garoppolo, left the game, and it was a back injury. What is concerning here is the fact that he didn't just head to the locker room, then he was taken to the hospital. I'm not sure exactly what's going on here. We'll get more information as the week goes on, but right now that should be enough to set off some alarm bells and think maybe Garoppolo is going to be out. Again, this guy's had so many injuries throughout his career. Brian Hoyer is the guy who came in, not Aiden O'Connell, the rookie, who had a rough time in his first start. So Hoyer, the backup, led the team. I mean, they were already winning, but led them, didn't make any mistakes, got a victory. I have a feeling Hoyer will be the guy who goes if Garoppolo's out, and I think that's actually fine for the wide receivers in this offense because he is a veteran. He's put up numbers before. He can get the ball to those receivers, make some plays without making too many mistakes. And finally, Ryan Tannehill in that London game in the fourth quarter, he left with an ankle injury, and after the game was seen wearing crutches. Malik Willis came in, did a capable job, definitely better than last year. It looks like he's the guy who might go. I mean, obviously, Tannehill, a good chance he's not playing if he's sporting crutches, although the Titans are on bye next week. So who are we going to pick up in order to make up for these injuries, all these byes coming up, and just underperforming players? Let's start at running back, and the CMC replacement that you should want, it's Jordan Mason. If you watch Beat the Breakout, you know that this is one of the guys I talked about in the very beginning of last week's video. And this is not foreshadowing of any sort of CMC injury. You can't predict those. But it's always possible, and this is the guy you want. Sure enough, we saw what happened. As soon as McCaffrey went out, Mason became the lead back, and he still looked good. Didn't get a lot of touches, but so far this season, he's averaging 5.5 yards per carry. We know that's mainly because of the system he's in. I mean, if you took Jordan Mason and you put him like the Pittsburgh Steelers offense, it'd probably be more like 3.5 yards per carry. Oh well, it doesn't matter. He's in the Niners offense. He's going to be productive given the chance. Eli Mitchell actually did play this game, but he ran behind Mason and he did not look good. And this is a guy who's just always injured as well. I think Mason has earned that job. It will probably be kind of a timeshare here, but Mason's the guy I'm interested in. He's the guy who's freely available in almost every fantasy league. So again, if you had CMC, you have to go out and make a claim for Mason basically. And even if you don't, you need somebody or you just want to have a guy with some upside for a couple of weeks, go pick up Mason. Now, the David Montgomery injury was not as serious, and who knows, maybe Gibbs does play next week. But either way, good chance that we see Craig Reynolds in a feature role. He did fill the void here in the second half against the Bucs. Not too good, 10 carries, 15 yards. But look, Tampa Bay has a good run defense. I think he'll be fine. It's not a great spot for him next week. I'm not going to go out and say, well, if you picked up Craig Reynolds, you have to start him. You don't. It's a road game against the Ravens, which is just kind of middle of the road run defense. Again, what matters here is the context, the opportunity. If he's getting 15 plus touches, he's on a Lions team that has one of the better offensive lines in the league, and they have the 6th most rushing yards per game. This is a team that wants to run the ball. Now, if you're looking for a wide receiver for week 7, I'm going to have to point you to Curtis Samuel, guy who you kind of just don't want to pay too close attention to because you think he's going to let you down, but he's been surprisingly consistent so far this year, and he's been better than Jahan Dotson and actually just as good as Terry McLaurin in terms of fantasy points. Even though Samuel is pretty much an afterthought for fantasy football drafts, he's averaging 5 targets a game, he's scored 3 touchdowns so far, he gets the occasional rush, and he's the guy who seems to be Sam Howell's kind of safety blanket here. This offense is very unpredictable. It seems like every week Eric Bieniemy just kind of picks a player or two to focus on. I don't know, that's working, I guess, to some extent, but this leaves a lot of the guys just out in terms of fantasy relevance week to week. But Curtis Samuel is the one guy who in this offense, besides maybe Brian Robinson, has been somewhat consistent. In fact, you might be shocked to know that after 6 weeks, he's the wide receiver 23 in fantasy in terms of PPR scoring. That means he's a low-end number 2 receiver. I'm not going to say I'm going to go so far as to consider him that on my fantasy team, but I feel pretty good about flexing him now. And going against the Giants next week, that's not going to scare me away at all. I think he's going to be one of your best streaming options out there, and he's available in a lot of fantasy leagues. Now, this player may not be available in most leagues. In fact, across the board, Deontay Johnson is exactly 71% rostered in every major platform. Not sure how that happened, but I will say you go out and check because he's been on IR. I know some leagues have IR spots so you can just stash a player like this, but some don't. And some people just get impatient and they drop a player like this, or maybe they've got so many players that they've added through trades or waivers, whatever, and now that they're going to have to activate Deontay Johnson for week 7, they don't want to drop anybody, so they'll just drop him instead. because they're disappointed with Steelers offense. They don't believe Deontay Johnson will help their team, whatever the case is. Check your waiver wire, look at the transactions. You should do this anyways. See who has been dropped, because after bye weeks or players that have been injured, sometimes they just get dropped. And if you are skeptical whether Deontay Johnson really will do anything after last year not scoring a single touchdown, kind of disappointing most of the season, and of course, you just take a look at the way the Steelers' offense has been in 2023, I mean, there are reasons to be distrustful of Johnson. But remember, this is a guy who's been a Pro Bowler, had a really good season 2 years ago, and then last year, from the transition from Trubisky to a young Pickett, inexperienced Kenny Pickett, well, by the end of the season, had figured it out. In December, he averaged 76 yards per game. And each of the last 2 seasons, he had scored 8 and 7 touchdowns, respectively. He will find the end zone on occasion. If anything, his return, and he said he's coming back, he's playing week 7, it should help the offense. So it may not be likely that he's just out there available in your league. Don't assume he isn't. Go check. That brings me to another player coming off bye that might have been dropped, not just because of the bye, but also because of what happened in week 5. That is Romeo Doubs in Green Bay. After being really solid the first 4 games, that whole Packers offense just looked very different. Doubs specifically, only 1 catch for 4 yards, and that was against the Raiders. And so the narrative here for a lot of people is, well, Christian Watson's back. That means Doubs can be dropped. He's not somebody who's going to do anything anymore. That's not the case. It's not like he wasn't targeted at all. Look, Jordan Love had a terrible game. It was bad. But Doubs was still the lead receiver in terms of snap share. He was out there in 86% of the team's offensive snaps. He still got targeted, like I said, and he's a guy who had been really consistent until then. It was one bad game for a quarterback and receiver. Over his last 5 games, including that game, Romeo Doubs has been the wide receiver 31 in PPR scoring. Before week 5, just those first 4 games, he was a top 25 fantasy receiver. I don't think Christian Watson makes him irrelevant. Doubs and Watson will be pretty much even, I think, going forward. Doubs specifically is really good against zone defense. In a couple weeks, they're going to play the Rams, which is one of the teams that plays the highest rate of zone coverage. And in the next 2 weeks, the Packers are going to face the Broncos and the Vikings, which are just 2 of the worst pass defenses out there, period. This is a nice stretch where Doubs could contribute. Again, there's a lot of places he might have been dropped. I would go out and check. And if nothing else, you need a receiver to get you by these next couple of weeks because of injuries or whatever. He's a very cheap buy low candidate. And because of that schedule, I'm actually going to recommend another Packer, A.J. Dillon. Look, some people did pick him up last week because Aaron Jones was out. But again, well, here comes the bye. Aaron Jones probably going to be back. Dillon goes back to waivers. I do think he should be picked up. First of all, we don't really know if Aaron Jones is going to play for sure this week, and if he does, how healthy he's going to be. But again, it's the Broncos. The rule of thumb, number 1 this year in fantasy, you start your receivers and your running backs, especially against the Broncos. Dillon had been miserable the first few weeks, but in that game where he was the man against the Raiders, he did get 76 yards and a touchdown. Still not a great rushing average, but sometimes volume will trump efficiency. And when you have a team like the Broncos giving up 5.8 yards per carry, just so easy to run against them. Even if Jones does play, you need somebody to fill in your RB2 because of injuries and buys. I could still recommend Dillon. And then a little bit lower on the ownership threshold here, Rashawn Johnson, also a guy that you could scoop up now. Didn't play this past week because he was in concussion protocol. Very good chance he does play next week, and he'll probably take over the starting job. D'Onta Foreman held it down. He was okay in week 6, 15 carries, 65 yards. But here's what Foreman didn't do: catch any passes, only got 1. Rashawn Johnson, that is his specialty. He's a good pass catcher, and he's also a big, tough runner. I think he becomes the lead guy. I don't think he's going to be a workhorse, going to be the only guy, because they'll probably mix in Foreman, maybe Darrington Evans a little bit. But I think Johnson now gets a chance to stake his claim to that starting RB job. If Justin Fields does miss, they're going to go through the running game a lot more. I guarantee they don't want this rookie Division II quarterback agent to be winning games for them or trying. They're going to keep it on the ground. They're going to keep everything really close to the line of scrimmage. So I think this could be a nice source of volume for Rashawn Johnson, and he could keep that job going forward. And while it's bad timing for a Bears offensive player with Justin Fields potentially out at week 2, who knows how long, this is a good stretch schedule-wise for them because they're going to get the Raiders, Chargers, and Panthers in 3 of their next 4 games. Those are all subpar defense. And again, I'm going to recommend a player that I said you should be stashing just a few days ago. Hope you listened, because if you need a tight end, it looks like Michael Mayer is a player that you should be targeting. Saw that little bump in usage, meaning he actually did get targeted last week after only catching 1 pass in the first 4 games. And now he actually led the team in receiving this past week, 5 catches for 75 yards. That's right, more than Devontae Adams and more than Jacoby Myers. Mayer has now become a part of this passing offense, and with Hunter Renfrow potentially being gone, they're trying to trade him, and even so it doesn't matter. They're just not using him. They're really not using other receivers. Mayer is going to continue to get targeted, and this is a player who now becomes a very interesting upside play at tight end. And the Raiders do play the Bears next week, so again, you're looking for a streamer. I'm putting him right up there at the top of the list. And then with all those quarterback injuries and bye weeks, again, you might need some help. I'm going to point you to Derek Carr. I get it. Carr's numbers have not been super impressive this year. He had a really good game in week 1, and then he finally threw for some yardage this past week. There's 2 things to consider here. First of all, Carr has not played a defense that is in even the bottom half of pass defense. He's had a really tough schedule, especially the last couple of games. This past one against Houston, this was the weakest pass defense that he has faced, which is why he was able to go for over 300 yards. And they're still just kind of right there in the middle. And plus, you have to remember a couple of weeks ago, he dealt with that shoulder injury. He missed most of one game, and then he really should not have come back and played the next game, which is why he just dinked and dunked, and the numbers looked bad as a result. And then that blowout against New England, he really didn't even have to pass or do anything. I don't always want to be in completely on Thursday night games, but I think the Saints-Jaguars could be a high-scoring affair. I think the Saints will definitely have to keep their foot on the gas pedal. They're going to throw it deep, and this is what I like because Carr has no problem chucking. He's got guys like Olave, Rashid Shaheed to throw it to. And right now, the Jaguars are allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. When it comes time to stream a QB, Carr is going to be my first choice. All right, don't forget to keep it locked here in the Fantasy Endgame all week, every week. We got what you need to help you set those winning lineups. Check out this week's playlist right here.